Have you ever felt something watching you in the dark, just beyond the shadows? In this video, we explore terrifying encounters with mysterious figures lurking in the night, creatures that don't belong in our world. From haunted farmhouses to eerie forests, each story will pull you deeper into the unknown, where every sound and shadow might hide something sinister. Make sure to stay until the end, and share in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss the chilling revelations that will leave you questioning what might be lurking just outside your door. The figures watching from the forest. In 1989, the quiet town near the Russian River in California was the kind of place where strange things were whispered about but rarely seen. That all changed for Clara on a night she would never forget. She had been at a party with her best friend, Marianne, deep in the woods near the river. The party had been lively, filled with laughter and the sound of music drifting through the trees. But as the night wore on and the crowd thinned, Clara and Marianne found themselves alone, waiting for a ride that was late. The air was cool, and a dense mist began to roll in from the river, shrouding the trees in an eerie fog. The two women stood at the edge of the clearing, chatting quietly to pass the time. It was then, in the midst of their conversation, that Clara noticed something moving among the trees. At first, she thought it was just the fog playing tricks on her eyes, but when Marianne gasped and pointed, Clara realized it was much more than that. Towering above the tree line were four massive, humanoid figures, moving slowly and deliberately. The figures were enormous, far taller than any human, their forms barely visible through the mist but unmistakably there. They moved in unison, like they were following a leader, and the sight was so surreal that for a moment, Clara couldn't believe what she was seeing. The leader of the group stood out immediately. He wore what looked like a wide-brimmed hat and a long, flowing coat that seemed to ripple in the windless night. His face was hidden, but Clara could feel his gaze on them, piercing through the darkness. It was an oppressive presence, one that made the air around them feel thick and suffocating. Marianne grabbed Clara's arm, her voice trembling. "We need to go, now." Clara didn't need to be told twice. The two women turned and ran, their footsteps crunching loudly on the gravel path as they fled the clearing. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees looming overhead, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The mist thickened, and the sound of the river in the distance grew louder, but all Clara could think about was the figures they had seen, those towering, silent figures that moved like they didn't belong in this world. By the time they reached the main road, they were breathless, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't speak of what they had seen, not at first. It was too strange, too terrifying to put into words. But as they stood by the side of the road, waiting for the headlights of their friend's car to appear, they knew they had witnessed something otherworldly, something that didn't belong in the quiet woods of California. And though the figures had disappeared into the mist, the memory of them lingered, a shadow that would follow Clara for years to come. Clara and Marianne didn't speak much during the drive home that night. Their friend had picked them up not long after they fled the clearing, and the ride was filled with an uneasy silence. Every time Clara glanced at Marianne, she saw the same fear reflected in her eyes. Neither of them could shake the sight of the towering figures looming over the forest. It was too strange, too impossible to be real, and yet, they had both seen it. For days afterward, Clara tried to convince herself that it had been a trick of the light, an illusion created by the fog and shadows. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the trees, wouldn't leave her. Even in the safety of her home, nestled near the river, she couldn't shake the sense that those figures were still out there, somewhere in the dense woods, waiting. As the weeks passed, Clara and Marianne finally spoke about the encounter. They recounted the details to each other, trying to piece together what they had seen. The figures moved in unison, they agreed, and the one leading them had been dressed differently, more defined, more distinct than the others. But the rest of the details were harder to grasp. The fog had obscured much of the sight, and the whole experience felt dreamlike, as if it had slipped through their fingers the moment it happened. Neither of them had a clear explanation, but deep down, they knew what they had seen wasn't human. It was something otherworldly, something that didn't belong in the woods they had known all their lives. And that knowledge was what frightened them the most. Over time, the memory faded, as most things do. Life went on, and while Clara continued to live in her house by the river, she rarely ventured into the woods at night anymore. The fear that had gripped her that night remained, lingering at the edges of her mind. But with no further sightings and no answers, it became easier to push the encounter to the back of her thoughts. That was, until the strange occurrences began again, this time, involving her son. Years later, when Clara had almost convinced herself that the figures had been nothing more than an eerie illusion, her son began to experience unsettling things near the same forest. He was only 12 when it started. At first, he complained of hearing strange sounds at night, low, droning noises that seemed to echo through the trees. He described seeing shapes in the distance, just beyond the tree line, standing still and silent. Clara felt a chill run through her as she listened to him. The memories of that night came rushing back, clearer than ever. She hadn't told her son about the figures she and Marianne had seen all those years ago. It was a story she had buried, hoping it would stay in the past. But now, as her son described the shadowy figures, she couldn't help but feel the same dread creeping back into her life. Her son's experiences grew stranger with time. He began seeing the same towering shapes in the woods, especially at dusk, when the light was low and the mist began to rise from the river. And every time, Clara's fear deepened. The figures had returned, and now, it seemed, they were watching her son. Clara's fear grew with each passing day as her son continued to describe the figures in the woods. He spoke of them casually at first, as if they were some strange part of the landscape he had come to accept. But Clara knew better. She knew these weren't normal shadows or tricks of the light. The same fear that had gripped her all those years ago began to tighten its hold once again, and she couldn't bear the thought of her son encountering what she and Marianne had seen that night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the familiar mist rolled in from the river, Clara decided to confront the situation head-on. She hadn't told her son about her own experience with the figures. She had hoped to protect him from the fear she had carried for years. But now, with the strange sightings growing more frequent, she realized she couldn't keep it from him any longer. She sat him down at the kitchen table, the soft glow of the overhead light casting shadows on the walls. Her son, a quiet and thoughtful boy, listened intently as Clara recounted the events of that night in 1989. She told him about the towering figures, their slow, deliberate movements, and the leader with the wide-brimmed hat. She explained how the fear had frozen her and Marianne in place, how they had fled the clearing without looking back. Her son's eyes widened as he listened, but he didn't seem surprised. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if what Clara was saying confirmed something he had already suspected. "I've seen them," he said quietly when she finished her story. "The man in the hat, he's always in front. The others just follow him." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had feared that the figures were back, but hearing her son describe them so vividly made it all the more real. She asked him if he had ever tried to approach the figures, hoping desperately that he had kept his distance. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I've always stayed close to the house. But they don't come too close. They just watch." The word sent a chill through Clara. The figures had been watching her, too, all those years ago. She remembered the oppressive feeling of being observed, of being marked in some way by their presence. And now, it seemed, they had shifted their attention to her son. As the days went on, Clara became more vigilant, keeping a close eye on her son and watching the woods with a renewed sense of dread. She didn't let him out after dark anymore, and she made sure the windows and doors were locked tight every evening. But even with all her precautions, the figures remained. They didn't come closer, but they didn't leave either. They were always there, standing just beyond the tree line, silent and still. And every time Clara caught a glimpse of them, she felt the same cold terror she had felt that night by the river. Whatever these figures were, they hadn't forgotten her. And now, they were watching her family. Clara's unease had grown into full-blown dread as the days turned into weeks. The figures remained on the outskirts of the property, just beyond the tree line, where the mist rose thickest from the river. Every evening, as the sky darkened and the woods seemed to come alive with shadows, she would catch glimpses of them, tall, motionless shapes that loomed like sentinels over the forest. Their presence was undeniable, and though they never came closer, the weight of their watchfulness felt suffocating. Her son continued to see them as well. Although he never ventured too far from the house, his curiosity had been piqued. He would stand at the window in the evenings, his eyes fixed on the edge of the woods, where the figures silently observed. Clara, however, kept her distance. She knew better than to engage with whatever these beings were. The memory of that night in 1989, when she and Marianne had fled in terror, was enough to keep her on guard. There was something deeply unnatural about the figures. They moved in a way that defied explanation, slow, deliberate, and always in perfect unison. Their leader, the one with the wide-brimmed hat and flowing coat, was the most distinct of them all. Even from a distance, Clara could feel the oppressive force of his presence. It was as if he commanded the others, directing their silent vigil over the forest and her home. As the days passed, Clara became increasingly obsessed with watching the woods, her thoughts consumed by the strange figures. She had once tried to rationalize the experience, to convince herself that it had been an illusion or a trick of the light. But the continued sightings by both her and her son confirmed what she had long feared: the figures were real, and they were here for a reason. Late one evening, as the mist rolled in heavier than usual, Clara found herself standing at the window, staring into the darkness. The figures were there, as they always were, but tonight something felt different. The air was colder, heavier, and there was a strange stillness that settled over the woods. She sensed that something was about to happen. Suddenly, the leader of the figures stepped forward, breaking the unchanging pattern that had defined their presence for so long. His movement was slow and deliberate, as though he was making a decision. For the first time in years, he was no longer content to stand on the edge of the trees. Clara's heart raced as she watched him. She could feel the weight of his gaze, though his face was still obscured by the shadows of his hat. The other figures remained behind him, perfectly still, waiting. The sense of dread that had been growing within her all these years now surged, a tidal wave of fear that left her frozen in place. The figure stopped, standing just outside the boundary of the property. It was as if he was testing the invisible line that separated him from her world. He lingered for a moment, then slowly turned back toward the woods. The figures retreated, melting into the mist as if they had never been there. But Clara knew better. They hadn't left for good. They would return, and when they did, it wouldn't be just to watch. Whatever they were, whatever their purpose, it was far from over. Night fishing turns to terror in Tennessee. The Tennessee mountains were a favorite getaway for Mark and his wife, Lisa. They loved the tranquility of the wilderness, the untouched beauty of the forests, and the sense of adventure that came with leaving civilization behind. This weekend was no different. They had set up camp deep in the heart of the mountains, far from the usual trails. For the first 2 nights, the peace of the forest enveloped them, the only sounds being the soft rustle of the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. By the 3rd night, however, a strange tension began to settle over the campsite. The usual sounds of the forest had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the air feel thick and heavy. Lisa noticed it first, her instincts telling her that something wasn't right. She had always been more attuned to the wilderness than Mark, and though she couldn't explain it, she felt uneasy. Despite her warnings, Mark decided to go night fishing at the lake nearby. He was an experienced outdoorsman, confident in his abilities, and didn't see any reason to worry. After all, they were deep in the mountains, far from any dangerous wildlife, or so he thought. Ignoring the nagging feeling in the back of his mind, he grabbed his fishing gear and headed toward the lake, promising Lisa he wouldn't be long. The lake was still and calm, the water reflecting the full moon overhead. Mark sat up near the shore, casting his line and settling into the quiet of the night. But that silence quickly became unsettling. The normal sounds of the forest, crickets, frogs, the rustling of small animals, were absent. It was as if the entire wilderness had fallen into a strange, unnatural hush. As Mark sat waiting, a low, distant howl cut through the silence. It was unlike any animal sound he had ever heard. Long and guttural, it echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down his spine. He tensed, gripping his fishing rod tightly, his eyes scanning the tree line. The sound was eerie, almost unnatural, and it stirred something primal in him, fear. The howl came again, this time closer. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching him from the edge of the forest. They hovered in the darkness, unblinking, fixed on him. His heart began to race, and an icy dread settled in his stomach. He stood, backing away slowly, his hand reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. But as he raised the gun, his blood turned to ice. It wasn't loaded. Panic surged through him as he fumbled to load it, but his hands shook too much to steady the bullets. The glowing eyes remained fixed on him, and whatever creature they belonged to was getting closer, moving silently through the shadows of the trees. Suddenly, the underbrush rustled violently, and Mark knew he couldn't wait any longer. Abandoning his gear, he turned and sprinted toward the woods, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature followed, its massive form crashing through the forest behind him, its breath heavy and ragged as it closed in on him. Mark's legs burned as he sprinted through the forest, the sounds of snapping branches and heavy footfalls growing closer behind him. The creature, whatever it was fast, too fast. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything but the terrifying realization that it was gaining on him. The glowing yellow eyes had been enough to send chills down his spine, but now, the guttural growl that echoed through the trees confirmed his worst fear: he was being hunted. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as he dodged low-hanging branches and leapt over roots, his boots skidding on the damp forest floor. Every time he glanced back, he could see the creature's massive silhouette closing in, its form barely visible in the shadows, but its presence unmistakably large and menacing. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees, casting long, jagged shadows that made the forest seem even more foreboding. In the chaos of his escape, Mark's mind raced. He had been in the wilderness countless times, but he had never encountered anything like this. Bears, wolves, he could handle those. But this was something else entirely. The sheer size of the creature, its speed, and those glowing eyes, it was like nothing he had ever seen. He could feel the primal fear gripping him, the instinctual need to survive overpowering any rational thought. His lungs burned as he pushed himself to keep running, but his body was quickly wearing down. The uneven terrain made it difficult to keep his footing, and more than once, he stumbled, barely catching himself before crashing to the ground. He could hear the creature's heavy breathing, the snap of twigs under its massive feet. It was right behind him. Just as he felt his strength beginning to wane, Mark spotted a break in the trees ahead. The forest opened up, and beyond the clearing, he saw the dam's walkway, a narrow bridge that crossed over a deep ravine. It was his only chance. The creature was too large to follow him through the narrow passageway. If he could just reach it in time, he might have a chance to escape. With every ounce of energy left in him, Mark surged forward, his legs screaming in protest as he sprinted for the dam. He could feel the creature closing in, its hot breath on the back of his neck, its massive form looming closer with each passing second. The growl it emitted sent shivers down his spine, but he didn't dare look back. Finally, he reached the walkway and threw himself onto the narrow bridge, his feet slipping on the slick concrete. As he scrambled to his feet, the creature crashed against the fence that lined the walkway, its massive claws reaching through the gaps, swiping at him with terrifying force. Mark barely managed to roll out of the way as one of the claws scraped across the ground where he had just been. The creature's snarls echoed through the ravine, its glowing eyes burning with fury as it tried to reach him. But the narrowness of the walkway kept it from advancing any further. For a moment, Mark stood frozen, staring at the beast that had chased him through the forest. It was massive, wolf-like, but unlike any wolf he had ever seen, its body hunched and powerful, its yellow eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. With a final, frustrated snarl, the creature retreated into the darkness of the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Mark collapsed onto the walkway, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. His entire body trembled, both from exhaustion and the sheer terror of what had just happened. He could still hear the faint rustling of the creature retreating into the forest, but the night had fallen into an eerie silence once again. It was as though the mountains themselves had been holding their breath, waiting for the predator to leave. For a few minutes, Mark lay there, too shaken to move. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just encountered. The glowing eyes, the unnatural howl, the speed at which it moved, none of it made sense. He had spent years in the wilderness, hunting, fishing, exploring, but never had he faced anything so primal and terrifying. He couldn't shake the image of the creature's massive claws reaching for him, barely missing him by inches. As his breathing steadied, Mark realized he needed to get back to camp, to Lisa. She had warned him not to go night fishing, and now, more than ever, he wished he had listened. But there was no time for regret. He had to make sure she was safe. The thought of the creature coming after her sent a new wave of fear surging through him. Mark struggled to his feet, his legs still shaky from the adrenaline. He glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching him again, but the tree line remained dark and still. The only sound was the distant rush of the river below, and the occasional gust of wind that swept through the ravine. It was as if the creature had melted into the night, leaving no trace of its presence. He began the long trek back to camp, his senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent his heart racing. He knew the creature was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance. The narrow path wound through the dense forest, the moonlight barely breaking through the thick canopy of trees. Mark kept his rifle at the ready, though he knew it wouldn't be much use. The creature had already proven itself faster and stronger than anything he had ever encountered. As he neared the campsite, a strange sense of calm settled over him. The fire Lisa had built earlier still flickered faintly in the distance, casting a soft glow over the clearing. The sight of it was comforting, a beacon of safety in the dark wilderness. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the creature hadn't gone far. He quickened his pace, relief washing over him when he finally reached the edge of the clearing. Lisa was still inside the tent, unaware of the terror that had unfolded just beyond the trees. For a moment, Mark considered waking her, telling her everything, but he hesitated. How could he explain what had happened without sounding insane? He wasn't even sure if he fully believed it himself. Instead, he sat down by the fire, his eyes scanning the dark tree line, watching for any sign of movement. The creature was out there. He knew it. And though it had retreated for now, he wasn't sure it was gone for good. Mark spent the rest of the night by the fire, unable to sleep. Every sound from the forest set his nerves on edge, every gust of wind making him jump. His mind replayed the chase through the woods, the way the creature had moved, its glowing eyes, and the terrifying reach of its claws. Though the fire crackled softly beside him, offering some comfort, he knew it wouldn't be enough to protect them if the creature returned. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting the forest in a golden light. The terror of the night began to fade with the warmth of the morning, but the memory of what had happened lingered in Mark's mind. He hadn't imagined it, whatever had hunted him was real. He could still feel the cold sweat on his skin, his muscles sore from the adrenaline that had surged through him. Just as he stood to pack up the camp, the sound of vehicles approached in the distance. It was the park rangers, making their morning rounds. Mark waved them down, hoping for some sense of relief or explanation. When the rangers pulled up, he quickly recounted the events of the night, the strange howl, the glowing eyes, the chase through the woods. He explained how the creature had cornered him on the dam walkway, its massive form too large to follow him across. The rangers listened, their faces betraying a hint of disbelief. One of them, a middle-aged man with years of experience in the mountains, asked Mark to describe the creature again. Mark did his best to convey the terror he had felt, the unnatural size of the beast, and the way it had moved with both intelligence and primal aggression. But the more he spoke, the more he could see the skepticism in their eyes. "We've had reports of wolves in the area before," one of the rangers said, trying to sound reassuring. "But nothing as large as what you're describing. Are you sure it wasn't just a bear?" Mark shook his head. "This was no bear," he insisted, his voice firm. "It moved too fast, and its eyes, they were glowing. It was like nothing I've ever seen before." The rangers exchanged glances, then shrugged. We'll take a look around the area, see if we can find any tracks or signs of an animal. But it's not uncommon for people to hear strange noises in the mountains at night. It could have been anything. Mark knew they didn't believe him. To them, he was just another camper who had let the isolation of the wilderness get to his head. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching, waiting. And he couldn't help but wonder if it would come for him again. As the rangers left to patrol the area, Mark and Lisa packed up the campsite. Lisa, sensing his unease, didn't press him for details about the night. She trusted his instincts, and the tension in the air was enough to convince her that something had indeed happened. By the time they left the mountains, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in his gut. The creature hadn't taken him that night, but it had come close. And as they drove away, Mark glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see those glowing yellow eyes watching from the shadows. Whatever it was still out there. And Mark had no doubt that he had barely escaped with his life. The night a skinwalker stalked me. The forests of northern Alberta had always been a place of solitude and peace for Daniel. He had spent countless trips out here, enjoying the quiet escape from city life. This time, however, felt different. He had rented a remote cabin deep in the wilderness, a spot so isolated that it took hours of driving down old logging roads to reach. He was used to being alone, but something about this trip unsettled him from the moment he arrived. The cabin was small but sturdy, nestled between towering trees that cast long shadows as the sun began to set. As Daniel unpacked, the usual comfort he felt in the wilderness was replaced by a strange tension he couldn't quite place. The air felt thicker, the forest quieter than usual, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Brushing off the unease, he focused on preparing the cabin for the night. By the time he lit the wood stove and settled in with a book, darkness had fully fallen, and the only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant rustle of leaves outside. For a while, everything seemed normal. The stillness of the forest was calming, but as the night grew later, that calmness began to shift. It started with faint noises, soft footfalls outside the cabin, almost imperceptible at first. Daniel assumed it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a fox, but the sounds persisted. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each pass. His eyes darted to the door, his mind racing. He listened intently, waiting for the sounds to fade, but instead, they grew closer, more deliberate, as if something, or someone, was moving around the cabin, observing. Then came the voice. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. The voice sounded like him. It mimicked his own tone and cadence, calling out from just beyond the door. "Let me in." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He stood frozen, staring at the door. It was unmistakable, his own voice was calling to him from the other side. He knew no one else was out here. He hadn't seen another person for miles. His skin prickled with fear, his grip tightening on the rifle he had brought with him for protection. Something was wrong. The voice called again, more insistent this time. "Let me in." Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving the handle. His mind raced with explanations, but none of them made sense. There was no way it could be him on the other side. His pulse quickened, and the air in the cabin seemed to grow colder, heavier. The footsteps outside circled again, this time accompanied by a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. As the voice and the sounds grew more intense, Daniel knew he was no longer alone in the forest. Whatever was out there wasn't human, and it was getting closer. The minutes stretched on endlessly, and the voice outside the cabin continued to grow louder, more demanding. Each time it spoke, it mimicked Daniel's voice perfectly, but there was something off, something cold and hollow in the way the words were spoken. He could hear the voice circling the cabin now, as if the creature, or whatever it was trying to find a way in. His own voice echoed in the darkness, "Let me in." Daniel's mind raced. He had heard stories about skinwalkers, creatures that could take on human form, mimic voices, and lure their victims into traps. But those were just legends, old tales told by people in remote parts of the world. They couldn't be real, could they? The terror he felt told him otherwise. Clutching his rifle tightly, Daniel moved toward the corner of the cabin, positioning himself as far from the door as possible. His eyes remained fixed on the door, every creak and groan of the wooden structure sending his heart into overdrive. Outside, the footsteps continued to circle, accompanied by that same eerie voice, each time more forceful and urgent. The creature outside was relentless. It paced around the cabin, scratching at the walls, rattling the windows, as if testing the strength of the building. The door trembled with each movement, the thin barrier between him and whatever lurked outside feeling more fragile by the second. But Daniel knew he couldn't let it in. Whatever it was no friend, and it certainly wasn't human. Then, the noise stopped. For a brief moment, silence fell over the cabin. The voice, the footsteps, the scratching, it all ceased. Daniel held his breath, his ears straining to catch any hint of movement. The sudden quiet was unnerving, almost worse than the noise. He stood frozen, every muscle in his body tense, waiting for something to happen. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, but this time they weren't coming from the ground outside. They were above him, on the roof. His blood ran cold as he listened to the unmistakable sound of something large pacing back and forth on top of the cabin. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the roof to the other. Whatever was up there was too heavy to be any ordinary animal, and the way it moved was unsettling, almost methodical, as if it were searching for a way inside. The roof creaked under the weight of the creature, and Daniel could hear the faint scraping of claws against the wooden shingles. His pulse raced, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps as the reality of the situation set in. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The only thing standing between him and the creature was the thin walls of the cabin and his rifle, which suddenly felt inadequate in his trembling hands. The pacing continued, the sound echoing through the small cabin, each step heavier than the last. Daniel knew he had to stay awake, had to keep his focus, because whatever was out there wasn't giving up easily. The pacing on the roof continued, a rhythmic, deliberate thud of heavy steps that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. He sat frozen in the corner of the cabin, clutching his rifle tightly, his eyes darting between the ceiling and the door. The creature moved as though it knew exactly what it was doing, as if testing his resolve, waiting for a moment of weakness. The voice came again, this time, quieter, more sinister. It echoed from above, mingling with the scraping of claws across the shingles. "Let me in," it whispered, once again in Daniel's own voice. The sound of it made his skin crawl. It was as if the creature was taunting him, trying to break him. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as he fought the rising panic. The walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in, the once cozy space now a cage. He glanced toward the windows, but the thick darkness outside revealed nothing. The only thing he could hear was the steady pacing above him, and the occasional tap of claws, as though the creature were trying to find a weak spot in the structure. Hours seemed to pass as Daniel sat in silence, gripping the rifle so tightly that his hands began to ache. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but there was no way out. The forest was too dense, the cabin too isolated. Running would only put him in more danger. He had no choice but to wait it out, hoping that the creature would eventually lose interest and leave. Then, suddenly, the pacing stopped. The abrupt silence was deafening. Daniel held his breath, listening intently. The weight on the roof shifted, and for a moment, he feared the creature had found an entry point. His eyes flicked toward the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, and still there was no sound. No footsteps, no scratching, just an eerie, oppressive quiet that hung heavy in the air. Daniel's body was stiff with fear, every muscle tensed, waiting for the next move. The silence was unbearable, each passing second stretching into an eternity. Just when he thought the creature might have finally left, he heard it again, this time, from the ground outside the cabin. The voice, now more distant but still unmistakable, called out, "Let me in." Daniel's stomach twisted in knots. The creature was no longer on the roof, but it hadn't gone far. It was still there, watching, waiting, circling the cabin once more. He felt its presence, lurking just beyond the walls, as if it were studying him, trying to figure out the best way to break through his defenses. The rest of the night dragged on, with Daniel never daring to close his eyes. The creature stayed just outside, occasionally calling out in that terrifying imitation of his voice, but it never made another attempt to enter the cabin. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, the sounds finally ceased. Exhausted and shaken, Daniel slowly lowered his rifle, his muscles aching from hours of tension. The creature was gone, for now. As the morning light filtered through the dense trees, Daniel slowly rose from his corner, his body stiff and sore from staying awake all night. The cabin, now bathed in soft sunlight, felt less oppressive, but the memory of the night's terror clung to him like a shadow. He cautiously approached the window, peering outside to make sure the creature was truly gone. The forest was quiet, as if the events of the night had been nothing more than a nightmare. But Daniel knew better. His hands still trembled slightly as he opened the cabin door and stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at his skin. He needed to see if there was any sign of the creature, some proof that what he had experienced was real. His boots crunched on the frost-covered ground as he circled the cabin, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. That's when he saw them, footprints. Both human and something else. The human footprints were faint, as if someone had walked barefoot through the forest. But beside them, overlapping and intertwining, were clawed tracks, larger, deeper, and far more menacing. The two sets of prints trailed around the cabin, marking the path the creature had taken during the night. They led toward the back of the cabin, where the roof was low enough for the creature to climb. Daniel's heart raced as he followed the prints, his mind reeling. The human footprints, they were too familiar. It was as if the creature had been mimicking him, not just in voice, but in form as well. The clawed tracks beside them only added to the horror. Whatever had stalked him through the night had the ability to shift between human and something far more sinister. He reached the back of the cabin, where the tracks disappeared into the underbrush. The forest stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, and he knew there was no way to track the creature further. It had vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind only the chilling reminder of its presence. For a long time, Daniel stood there, staring at the spot where the tracks ended, trying to make sense of what had happened. The stories he had heard about skinwalkers, the creatures that could mimic humans and take on terrifying forms, now felt all too real. He had come face to face with something ancient, something that defied explanation. The realization hit him hard. Whatever it was, it hadn't come to attack him. It had come to torment him, to toy with him, as if testing his resolve. The pacing on the roof, the mimicry of his voice, it was all a game, and Daniel had barely survived the night. As he packed up his gear, his mind was clouded with thoughts of what he had experienced. The cabin, once a place of solitude and peace, now felt tainted, haunted by the presence of the creature that had stalked him through the night. He knew he would never return. By the time he left the cabin and began the long drive back to civilization, Daniel still couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see those clawed footprints following him along the road. Though the creature had disappeared with the dawn, its presence lingered in his mind, a reminder that in the deep, dark forests of northern Alberta, something else was out there. Something that could wear a human face, but was anything but human. The haunting eyes in the dark woods. The birthday party had been lively, the forested clearing filled with laughter and the crackling of the bonfire. It was an evening of celebration, surrounded by close friends and the familiar, comforting sights of nature. As the night wore on, the fire dwindled, and the guests slowly began to disperse. Most opted for the safety of the main road back to the village, but not Elias. He had always enjoyed the tranquility of the forest and decided to take the old, winding path through the trees, which led past the ruins of an ancient castle. The path was one he had walked many times before. The familiar crunch of leaves under his boots, the cool night air brushing against his face, it was calming. The forest was dark, but Elias knew it well. Even the silhouette of the castle ruins, barely visible in the distance, felt like an old companion, standing watch over the woods. However, as he walked deeper into the forest, something shifted. The sounds of the night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, suddenly ceased. It was as if the entire forest had fallen into a deep, unnatural silence. Elias slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. The absence of sound was unsettling. The once familiar path now seemed alien, every shadow stretching longer, every movement of the trees more ominous. The castle ruins loomed closer, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. As he neared the crumbling stone walls, a chill crept up his spine. His footsteps, which had been steady and confident, now felt too loud in the silence. He stopped, listening. But there was nothing, just that oppressive quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. That's when he saw them, two glowing eyes, staring at him from within the dense trees. At first, he thought it might be an animal, perhaps a deer or a fox, curious about his presence. But as the seconds passed, the eyes didn't blink, didn't move. They simply remained fixed on him, glowing with an unnatural, piercing intensity. A wave of unease washed over Elias, his instincts telling him that something was terribly wrong. He took a step back, his heart beginning to race. "Shoo!" he called out, trying to scare whatever it was away. His voice sounded small and hollow in the vast silence. The eyes didn't flinch. They continued to stare at him, unwavering, almost as if they were waiting for something. Elias's mouth went dry. He could feel his pulse quicken, his breath coming faster. The eyes were too high off the ground to be any normal forest creature, and the way they just lingered, it wasn't right. Every rational thought in his mind screamed at him to turn around and leave, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. He couldn't tear his gaze away from those glowing orbs. The forest around him seemed to close in, the trees towering like silent sentinels. Elias swallowed hard, his instincts finally taking over. Whatever was watching him, it wasn't something he wanted to confront. He needed to leave, now. Elias felt his body tremble as the silence pressed down on him, broken only by his own ragged breaths. The glowing eyes remained fixed, unblinking, watching from the darkness of the trees. The longer he stood there, the more he felt the weight of their gaze, as though they were studying him, waiting for him to make a move. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. He had heard tales of strange occurrences in the forest near the castle ruins, stories passed down through generations about spirits and shadowy figures that roamed the woods at night. But those were just stories, right? Folklore to entertain children, nothing more. Yet, here he was, frozen on a forest path, face to face with something that defied reason. Elias took a shaky breath, trying to calm his nerves. He couldn't let fear control him. Slowly, he reached down to pick up a nearby branch, gripping it tightly as if it could offer some form of protection. He knew it was a flimsy defense, but it made him feel just a little more in control. His eyes darted between the glowing orbs and the path behind him. If he could just make it to the village lights, he would be safe. He turned to look in the direction of the village. The faint glow of distant lamps was barely visible through the trees, a small flicker of hope amidst the oppressive darkness. His pulse quickened again. It wasn't far, he could make it if he ran. Taking one last glance at the eyes in the forest, Elias took a step backward. The eyes remained fixed on him, still unblinking, still eerily still. He swallowed hard and took another step, then another. The eyes followed his movement, but they didn't approach. It was as if they were waiting for him to leave, or perhaps for him to panic. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind him, sending a jolt of terror through his body. Without thinking, Elias bolted. His legs, once frozen in fear, now moved with a frantic urgency. He sprinted down the path, the branch he'd grabbed falling to the ground as his hands pumped by his sides. His breath came in rapid gasps, and his heart pounded in his chest, the cold night air stinging his lungs. The village lights seemed so far away, but he didn't dare look back. The thought of seeing those glowing eyes chasing him was enough to push him forward, faster and faster. His boots kicked up dirt and leaves, the path twisting beneath his feet as he dodged low-hanging branches. The forest seemed to blur around him, the once familiar surroundings now distorted by the fear surging through him. he could still feel it, whatever it was, watching him. The sensation of being pursued clung to him like a shadow, and no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind him. The village lights grew brighter, closer. Elias pushed himself harder, his legs burning with exhaustion. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, drowning out every other sound. All he wanted was to reach the safety of the village, to escape the unseen terror that lurked behind him. Elias's lungs burned as he sprinted through the darkened forest, the village lights flickering in the distance like a beacon of hope. The pounding of his footsteps echoed in the eerie silence, but his mind remained fixed on the terror that had gripped him. He didn't dare glance back. The fear of seeing those glowing eyes following him was enough to propel him forward with every ounce of strength he had left. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The familiar path had turned into a maze of shadows, each turn a disorienting blur. But Elias didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His breath came in short, desperate bursts, and his pulse raced as though his heart might explode from the effort. The village lights grew nearer with each stride, but the oppressive sense of being watched remained, like an invisible weight pressing down on him. The glow from the eyes he had seen earlier lingered in his mind, their unblinking stare fixed on him even as he fled. It was as if whatever had been watching him was not chasing with speed but with an unsettling patience, waiting for him to falter. Elias's legs felt like lead as he pushed himself onward, the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to reach the village, to get as far away from the castle ruins and the mysterious eyes as possible. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, the only sound accompanying his frantic escape. As the lights of the village came into full view, the trees began to thin, offering a small reprieve from the suffocating darkness. His pace slowed as he reached the edge of the forest, his legs trembling from exhaustion. His chest heaved, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he was close, so close to safety. Just as Elias stumbled toward the first street lamp at the village's edge, he allowed himself one glance back. The forest stood dark and still, the ancient trees swaying gently in the night breeze. But the glowing eyes were gone. The oppressive silence had lifted, and the feeling of being watched had vanished, as though whatever had been following him had retreated back into the shadows of the forest. Elias collapsed near the base of the street lamp, the cool light casting long shadows on the ground. His hands trembled as he tried to steady his breathing, his heart still racing from the encounter. The fear that had driven him through the forest was slowly replaced by a sense of disbelief. Had it really happened? Had he truly seen those eyes, or was it the product of his tired mind and the eerie surroundings? As he sat there, catching his breath, the village around him seemed calm and undisturbed. The warm glow of the lamps lined the quiet streets, and there was no sign of danger, no hint of the terror that had just gripped him so tightly. But Elias knew what he had seen. Those glowing eyes, watching him from the trees, they had been real, and they had been something far from ordinary. Elias remained on the ground for several minutes, his back against the cold metal of the street lamp, trying to piece together the events of the night. His body still trembled with adrenaline, but the immediate danger had passed. The village, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, seemed like a sanctuary compared to the oppressive darkness of the forest. He glanced back at the path he had just sprinted through, now obscured by the trees and the distant silhouette of the old castle ruins. The eyes, those unblinking, glowing eyes, were nowhere to be seen. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something still lurked in the forest, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Gathering his strength, Elias stood, his legs still wobbly beneath him. He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs as he forced himself to calm down. His heart had finally slowed, but the weight of the encounter clung to him like a shadow. What had he seen? What could possibly have those glowing eyes, so high off the ground, yet so still, so patient? Elias's mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. The stories he had heard over the years, the local legends about spirits and mysterious creatures that haunted the old castle ruins, suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. He had always dismissed those tales as superstitions, but tonight they felt far too real. He began walking toward the center of the village, glancing over his shoulder every few steps, half expecting the glowing eyes to reappear at the edge of the trees. But the forest remained still, shrouded in darkness, as if the events of the night had been nothing more than a strange dream. Yet Elias knew better. He had felt the fear, the oppressive silence, the cold gaze of those eyes following him through the forest. As he reached the familiar cobbled streets of the village, a sense of relief washed over him. The lights, the houses, the distant sounds of life, it was all so comforting after the terror he had just experienced. But even in the safety of the village, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. It may not have left the forest, but it was still out there, lurking, waiting. He didn't mention the glowing eyes to anyone that night. Instead, he went straight home, locking the door behind him and double-checking the windows, making sure every corner of the house was secure. The night passed in uneasy sleep, his mind replaying the moment he first saw the eyes, the silence of the forest, and the overwhelming need to run. The next morning, Elias woke with a start, the events of the previous night flooding back as soon as his eyes opened. He couldn't help but wonder if he had been the only one to encounter whatever it was that stalked the path near the ruins. Perhaps others had seen it, too, but had chosen to stay silent, just as he had. One thing was certain, Elias wouldn't be walking that path again anytime soon. The forest, once a place of peace and familiarity, had transformed into something else entirely, something haunted by the memory of glowing eyes and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Whatever it was that lingered in those woods, Elias hoped he would never encounter it again. The night a ghostly figure appeared. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a sprawling forest, its wooden exterior weathered by years of harsh winters and summer storms. For as long as Amelia and her sister, Clara, could remember, their father had lived there, isolated but content. After their mother passed away, the farmhouse became a place of quiet routine, with their father keeping to himself, tending to the land and the animals. It was a peaceful life, but something about the place always unsettled Clara. The deep woods, the eerie silence at night, it never felt quite right. Amelia, on the other hand, had always been more at ease in the farmhouse. She saw it as a refuge, a place where they could all gather and remember their mother. So, when their father invited them for a weekend stay, Amelia was eager to go, while Clara reluctantly agreed, her unease masked by her love for family. The first night was quiet, though Clara found it difficult to sleep. Something about the house, with its creaking floorboards and the faint rustling of trees just beyond the window, made her uneasy. She tossed and turned, her mind playing tricks on her. Every sound seemed amplified, the ticking of the clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional groan of the old house settling into the earth. Sometime after midnight, Clara jolted awake, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. It was then that she heard it, a soft, wet shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging across the floor. The noise seemed to come from the hallway, moving slowly between her bedroom and the room that used to belong to their mother. Clara sat up in bed, straining to listen, her pulse quickening with each passing second. At first, she thought it might be her father, wandering the house late at night as he sometimes did. But something about the sound, the way it dragged, heavy and damp, didn't seem right. It was too slow, too deliberate, like someone was deliberately trying to remain unnoticed. Gathering her courage, Clara slipped out of bed and crept toward the door. The footsteps continued, the soft shuffle growing louder as she approached the hallway. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally pulling the door open. The hallway was empty. The wet, shuffling sound had stopped abruptly, leaving only the eerie silence of the house. Clara stepped into the hall, her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced toward the living room. Her father was there, fast asleep in front of the TV, the faint glow of the screen casting long shadows on the walls. Confused and unnerved, Clara returned to her room, her mind racing with questions. Had she imagined the sound? Was it just the old house playing tricks on her? She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sign that the strange footsteps would return. But the house remained silent for the rest of the night, leaving Clara with an unsettling sense of dread that lingered long after she finally drifted off to sleep. The following day, Clara tried to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over her. Amelia seemed cheerful as ever, helping their father around the farm, laughing and reminiscing about their childhood. But Clara couldn't bring herself to join in fully. She kept thinking about the strange, wet footsteps she had heard the night before. Though she had convinced herself that it might have been her imagination, the sound had felt all too real in the moment. As the day wore on, Clara kept a close eye on the house. She noticed little things that made her uneasy, doors creaking open on their own, the occasional flicker of lights, and a cold draft that seemed to follow her no matter where she went. None of it was enough to scare her outright, but it all added to the sense that something was off about the farmhouse. That night, after dinner, Clara and Amelia sat with their father in the living room, chatting as the old TV hummed in the background. Their father, as usual, dozed off in his chair, lulled to sleep by the familiar comfort of the farm. As the hours passed, Amelia yawned, stretching her arms above her head. "I'm turning in for the night," she said, giving Clara a gentle nudge. "Don't stay up too late." Clara nodded, though she had no intention of going to bed anytime soon. She needed answers. She needed to know if what she had heard the night before was real, or if her mind had been playing tricks on her. So, instead of heading to bed, Clara decided to stay up and keep watch. If there was something unusual going on in the farmhouse, she was determined to find out. The night stretched on, the house settling into its usual creaks and groans as the wind whistled softly through the trees outside. Clara sat quietly in the living room, her eyes trained on the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Every now and then, she would glance at her father, still fast asleep in his chair, his breathing slow and steady. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that the wet, shuffling sound returned. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she heard it, the same slow, dragging footsteps from the night before. This time, the sound was unmistakable, louder and more deliberate, as if someone, or something, was pacing just beyond her view. She sat frozen in her chair, her grip tightening on the armrests as the footsteps grew louder, heading toward the kitchen. Summoning her courage, Clara stood and made her way toward the hallway, the sound of the footsteps growing more distinct with each step she took. She rounded the corner, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes landed on the figure in the kitchen. There, standing in the dim light of the moon streaming through the window, was a tall, pitch-black figure. Its shape was human, but there was something wrong, something unnatural about the way it stood, its head slightly tilted, its body unnervingly still. The wet sound of its footsteps echoed through the kitchen as it slowly paced back and forth. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, her body frozen in place. She wanted to scream, to wake her father, but no sound came out. All she could do was watch as the figure continued its slow, deliberate movement, its presence casting a cold shadow over the room. Clara's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she stood frozen in the hallway, watching the tall, pitch-black figure pace the kitchen. Its footsteps echoed through the room, the wet, shuffling sound sending chills down her spine. The figure moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, its form unnervingly still, except for the slow, deliberate pace it kept. Clara's mind raced. What was it? A ghost? A spirit? Whatever it was, it didn't seem to notice her, or if it did, it made no attempt to approach. She glanced toward the living room, where her father still sat asleep, completely unaware of the strange presence in his home. She needed to wake him. She needed to do something. Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara stepped forward, her legs trembling beneath her. She moved as quietly as she could, keeping her eyes fixed on the figure, terrified that it might suddenly turn and face her. But the figure didn't seem to notice her approach. It continued its slow, measured pace, its wet footsteps filling the silence of the kitchen. Clara's heart raced as she reached her father's side. She shook him gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, wake up," she urged, her voice trembling. But her father remained motionless, lost in a deep sleep that seemed unnaturally heavy. Clara shook him again, harder this time. "Dad, please." Still, he didn't wake. Clara's panic grew. It was as if something was keeping him under, preventing him from waking up no matter how hard she tried. She glanced back at the kitchen, her stomach twisting with fear. The figure was still there, pacing back and forth, its presence a looming shadow that seemed to grow darker with each passing second. Desperation took hold of Clara. She shook her father with all her strength, her voice rising in urgency. "Dad! Please wake up!" But it was no use. He remained in the chair, his breathing slow and steady, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she realized she was on her own. She had no choice but to face whatever this thing was by herself. She turned back toward the kitchen, her body trembling, but to her horror, the figure had stopped moving. It stood completely still now, its back turned to her, its tall, shadowy form filling the room with a sense of dread that made Clara's skin crawl. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The wet footsteps had stopped, leaving only the sound of Clara's ragged breathing in the air. Then, slowly, the figure began to turn. Clara's heart nearly stopped as she watched, frozen in place, her legs refusing to move. The figure's movement was slow, deliberate, as if it knew the terror it was instilling in her. She couldn't see its face, if it had one, but the sheer wrongness of its presence was enough to send waves of fear crashing over her. With every ounce of strength she had left, Clara stumbled backward, her eyes never leaving the figure. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave, had to get out of the farmhouse before whatever this thing was did something worse. Clara's body moved on instinct as she stumbled back into the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't dare take her eyes off the figure in the kitchen, even as her hands fumbled to find the doorframe for balance. The farmhouse, once a place of comfort and childhood memories, now felt like a trap, its every shadow hiding something more sinister. The figure in the kitchen was still, its head slightly tilted, as if listening, waiting for her next move. The wet footsteps had ceased, but the oppressive presence of the figure filled the room, a dark, heavy weight pressing down on Clara's chest. She knew she had to get out. She had to leave the house, leave the farm, before the figure did something worse than just pacing the kitchen. Her father still lay slumped in his chair, breathing deeply as if nothing in the world could wake him. Clara's attempts to rouse him had failed, and now, in the growing panic, she knew that leaving him wasn't an option she wanted to consider, but the dread pushing at her from every side forced her to make a decision. With a deep breath, she turned and bolted for the door, her legs shaking as she stumbled toward the front of the house. The sound of her hurried footsteps echoed through the silent rooms, each step feeling like a betrayal as she left her father behind. But she had no choice. Fear gripped her mind, and her only thought was to get as far away from that figure as possible. As Clara reached the front door, she fumbled with the lock, her fingers trembling too much to work the latch. She could feel the cold presence of the figure behind her, its eyes, or whatever it had, boring into her back. Finally, with a loud click, the door swung open, and Clara stumbled out into the cold night air. The darkness of the night seemed almost welcoming compared to the terrifying stillness inside the farmhouse. She didn't stop running until she reached the gravel road that led away from the property. Only then did she turn back, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she looked at the dark silhouette of the farmhouse in the distance. Nothing moved. No figures emerged from the shadows. The house stood still and quiet, as if everything that had happened was just a figment of her imagination. But Clara knew better. The cold, wet footsteps, the unnatural figure pacing the kitchen, it was all real, far too real to be dismissed as a bad dream. She waited by the road, shivering in the cold, unsure of what to do next. She couldn't go back inside. Not after what she had seen. Not with that thing still lurking in the house. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon that Clara heard the creak of the front door opening. Her father emerged, rubbing his eyes and yawning as if he had just woken from a deep, dreamless sleep. He looked out toward the road where Clara stood, confused by her presence so far from the house. "Clara? What are you doing out here?" he called, his voice groggy. Clara could barely find the words to explain. All she knew was that they needed to leave the farm, and fast. And just like that, the darkness closes in again. Each of these terrifying encounters leaves us with one question: what's really hiding in the shadows? Whether it's a figure pacing in the kitchen or glowing eyes watching from the forest, these stories remind us that sometimes, the scariest things are the ones we can't explain. Which story gave you chills? Let us know in the comments, and if you have your own terrifying experience, we'd love to hear it. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, it really helps us grow. And before you go, check out more of our spine-chilling videos here. Stay safe, and thanks for watching.